Alright, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and as part of the Rankin Technical College AWD, or Application and Website Development Program, and in particular the AWD 1111.NET Framework with Web Databases class, I've been doing a series of video presentations based on the textbook that will be used for this class during the fall 2019 semester. That textbook, as shown on the screen right now, is Pro ASP.NET MVC 5, an A-Press text by Adam Freeman. I am in Chapter 17, and I'm on the bottom half of page 491, applying the custom authorization filter. And the author says to actually use this, we simply apply an attribute to the action methods or controllers that we want to protect. So we're going to go into our home controller. And let's see. Let's do save all. There's our home controller. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add a using statement. Oops. Using filters.infrastructure. So there's our filters. There's our infrastructure right there. It's gray because we haven't put in any associated code yet. We're going to do that next. So before our index, we want to add this. We've set the constructor method for the filter to false, meaning that local requests will be denied access to the index method. It says we can test this by starting the application. Let's save everything and let's start the application. The routing configuration should target the index action method when the root URL is requested. If the browser making the request is on the machine running Visual Studio, we'll see the result in figure 18.2 on page 492. And let's take a quick little sneak peek, and that's right here. However, the filter won't authorize the request if you change the constructor argument for the filter to true and then restart the application. Still loading. There it is. All right. So what we did here in our code was to specify that the admin user is authorized to invoke the index action method, but there is an implicit condition as well. The user must be authenticated. If we don't specify any users or roles, then any authenticated user can use this action method. For the most part, the authorization policy that the authorized attribute provides is sufficient. This next section on using authentication filters, it says here they provide the means to provide fine-grained control. So in other words, let me give you an example, and hopefully this will help. When we start talking about a database, okay, and you decide that in this database you want to have control over what gets entered, you can put requirements on the entire database, on any table or tables in that database, on any record or records in that database, and on any field or fields of any record in that database. All right, that's kind of what we're talking about here. The author mentions that authentication filters have a relatively complex lifestyle. They run before any other filter, which lets you define an authentication policy that will be applied before any other type of filter is used. They can also be combined with authorization filters to provide authentication challenges for requests that don't comply to the typical or normal authorization policy. They also run after an action method has been executed, but before the action result is processed. We'll see, as it says, some examples along the way here. All right. Authentication filters, as it says, implement the Authentication Filter interface, which is shown here. What does this mean? Well, notice that this interface has or defines two different methods. One called onAuthentication, which requires an authentic context object named context, and the other one is onAuthentication challenge, which requires an authentication challenge context, referred to as context. And as the author says here, the onAuthentication challenge method is called by the MVC framework whenever a request has failed the authentication or authorization policies for an action method. Okay. Properties defined by the authentication challenge context class are shown here on the bottom of page 493. They are the action descriptor and the result. The result the author mentions on the bottom of the page is the most important property because it allows the authentication filter to pass an action result to the MVC framework, a process that's known as short-circuiting. The best way of explaining how this works is through an example. All right, so the author says here on the bottom of the screen, in the blue on your screen, to my mind, the most interesting aspect of authentication filters is that they allow a single controller to define action methods that are authenticated in different ways. So my first step is to add a new controller that simulates Google logins. And they show this on the next page. So let's come in here. I don't even know if they gave us any instructions for this, but I'm going to right mouse click, add controller, and I'm going to call it, oops, I want it to be empty, to be a Google account controller. All right. We are going to replace the code that's in here with the code that is shown here on page 494. The author says after this code, I don't want to implement real Google logins because it means delving into the dark world of third-party authentication. Rather, we've created a terrible hack that will authenticate any username that ends with google.com as long as it provided the password of secret. At the moment, the Google authentication controller is not hooked up to the application, and that's where the authentication filter comes in. The author created a new class named Google Auth Attribute.cs in the infrastructure folder. So we go into the infrastructure folder, right mouse click, add class, and we want this to be called Google Auth attribute.cs. I think I spelled auth wrong. We are going to replace that boilerplate code that comes up with the code that's shown on the bottom of 494 and on 495. So let's get rid of that. Put in the code on the bottom of 494, which is right here. And as always, we're going to get error messages because we've only got part of the code implemented. And here's the rest on 485. All right. And the author says here that his implementation of the on-auth challenge, which you see right in front of you right now, it checks to see if the result property of the authentication challenge context argument has been set. This allows you to avoid challenging the user when the filter is run after the action method has executed. What's important for this section is the use of the on-authentication challenge method to challenge the user for credentials by redirecting their browser to the Google account controller. All right. On the bottom of page 495, the author mentions the authentication filter is ready to challenge users for their fake Google credentials. Now we can wire up the remaining behavior. The controller calls the on-authentication method before running any other kind of filter. This provides you with the opportunity to perform authentication checks. We don't have to implement the on-authentication method, but the author will do so here to check that we're dealing with a Google account. The method is passed then to it's passed in an authentication context object that is derived from the controller context and provides access to the information described in Chapter 17 and the information that you see right here. If the on-authentication, if it sets a value for the result property of the context object, then the MVC framework will call the on-authentication challenge method. If that method doesn't set a value for the result property, then one from the on-authentication method will be executed. So this is implementing a bunch of stuff in that Google auth attribute file. So what I'm going to do, make this smaller, try to get that to go away, grab all the code here, The implementation checks to see if the request has been authenticated using a username that ends with @google.com. If the request has not been authenticated, or the request is authenticated using a different kind of credential, and we set the result property to a new HTTP authorized result. The next step then is to apply the filter to the controller, and that's shown on the bottom of 496 and the top of page 497. So we need to bring up our home controller, and at the end of the home controller, so after the index method, we will add this Google authorization. So as mentioned here on page 497, we've defined a new action method called list right here. If this list has been decorated or we've added the Google Auth filter, the result is that access to the index method is secured through built-in support or forms authentication, but that access to the list action method is secured through the custom fake Google authentication system. You mentioned here you can see the effect by starting the application. Let's try what they say. Let's do a file, save all, and let's run the application. By default, the browser should target the index action method, which should trigger the standard authentication and require you to log in. All right, you may or may not remember, but we had here user and secret. All right, and we had in here admin and, oops, try it again, secret. All right, I think I'm going to stop for this part of the lesson now, and I'll continue on the middle of page 497, combining authentication and authorization filters. I'll be back with that shortly.